Give me 10 minutes, I'll show you exactly how you can preserve meat for a full year without electricity. Salt curing, smoking, canning, and a 2,000-year-old fat sealing trick most of you have never even heard of. So don't skip the video, watch it full. Let's start. What if I told you that the meat sitting in your fridge right now could last for an entire year, maybe longer, without electricity, without a freezer, without any of the modern stuff we think we absolutely cannot live without? And what if I told you that I grew up eating meat that was preserved exactly that way, and it was some of the best, most flavorful food I have ever tasted in my life? I am not talking about some survival trick or a prepper hack from the internet. I am talking about something my community did every single year, the same way their grandparents did it, the same way their great-grandparents did it, going back generations. And today I am going to walk you through every single method, every detail, the way it was actually done, because most people who talk about this stuff have never actually lived it. My name is Sarah. I am 24 years old, and I grew up in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, inside an old order Amish community. I left when I was 19, and that journey was its own complicated thing that I might talk about another time. But one of the things I will never leave behind is everything I learned in that community about growing food, raising animals, and keeping your family fed through an entire year without ever touching a refrigerator. These are not myths. These are not exaggerated folktales. This is what we actually did, and by the time this video is over, you are going to understand exactly why this knowledge is more valuable than almost anything they teach you in school. Let me start at the very beginning, which for us was always November. People in the outside world usually associate November with Thanksgiving, but in our community, November meant Butchering Day. And Butchering Day was the most important day of the entire farming calendar. When I say it was a community event, I mean the whole church came together. Every household, every family, every able hand showed up. I remember the first time I was old enough to help. I was maybe 8 years old, and I was absolutely amazed by how organized and how serious it all was. The men would handle the butchering itself early in the morning before most of the world was even awake. The cold November air was important because it naturally slowed down bacterial growth in the meat. Our community would process somewhere between 15 and 20 hogs in a single 2-day event. Nothing went to waste. Nothing. Every part of that animal had a purpose, and by the end of those 2 days, a family would have enough meat to carry them through an entire year. Now let me get into exactly how we kept that meat safe and delicious for months and months, because this is where it gets really interesting. The first method, and honestly the one that most people have heard of but few people actually understand, is salt curing. Salt is the oldest preservation ingredient on Earth. The science behind it is that
Brethren,
salt
the cold
pulls moisture
deepens. We
out
must
of the
decide
meat
on the
through
timber.
a process
Yeah, the
called
beams need
osmosis.
checking before the snow.
When you remove
The
the
logs from
moisture
the
from the
backfield
meat,
are ready.
bacteria
Good.
simply
We start
cannot
at first light.
survive. They need water to grow and multiply. And when that water is gone, they die, or they never get started in the first place. In our community, we used what is often called the salt box method, and it was
This cut looks
exactly
good
as
for the
straightforward
hams.
as it sounds.
Yeah, plenty
You
for the
take your large
smokehouse.
cuts, things
I'll
like
wrap these
hams,
for the cellar.
shoulders, and pork belly,
I'll sharpen the knives
and you
after.
completely bury them in coarse non-iodized salt. You press the salt firmly around every single surface. Then you put it in a cool, dry place, and you let it sit. For a large ham, we are talking about a week per inch of thickness. So a thick country ham might sit in that salt box for a solid month. When the curing is complete, the meat feels dense and firm all the way through, not soft in the center. The color changes to a deep, consistent reddish pink. If you press on it and it still feels soft and spongy in the middle, it needs more time. This is not something you rush. After the curing period, you pull the meat out and rinse it very thoroughly, because if you skip that step, the saltiness is overwhelming. Then you soak it in cold water, sometimes changing that water a few times over a day or two to draw out some of that excess salt before the next step. Now, a critical thing I want to mention, because I see a lot of people get this wrong
This
online.
load's heavy.
Proper curing
Careful
also
now.
involved
Aye.
something called curing salts,
We'll set them
which
inside.
contain
The
sodium
door's
nitrite.
unlatched.
In the old days, this came from natural sources, but the principle was the same. Sodium nitrite is what protects against Clostridium botulinum, which is the bacteria that causes botulism. Botulism is not something to play around with. It is colorless, odorless, and it can kill you. This is why the salt alone was never the only step, especially for hams and larger cuts that were going to hang or be stored long term. The salt, the curing salts, the cold temperature, the low moisture all work together as a system. After the salt curing came the smokehouse, and this is where I want to spend some real time, because the smokehouse in an Amish community is something special. Every property had one. Ours was a small wooden structure built maybe 20 feet away from the main house, which was intentional because fire was always a concern. The fire was built in a separate firebox outside, and the smoke traveled through a pipe or a trench into the enclosed smokehouse chamber. This separation was everything because what we were doing was called cold smoking, not hot smoking. Cold smoking keeps the temperature inside the smokehouse below about 90 degrees Fahrenheit, sometimes lower. You are not cooking the meat. You are bathing it in smoke to dehydrate it slowly and to coat the surface with the natural antimicrobial compounds that wood smoke contains. Phenols, aldehydes, and other organic compounds in the smoke are natural bacteria killers. They form a protective layer on the outside of the meat that acts almost like a seal. The wood we used mattered enormously. Hickory was the most common choice for pork because it gives a strong, rich, slightly earthy flavor that is just unbelievably good with ham and bacon. Apple wood was used when you wanted something sweeter and milder. Cherry wood gave a beautiful reddish color to the meat, along with a subtle fruity smoke. We never used pine or any softwoods because the resin in those woods creates a bitter chemical taste that ruins the meat completely. The smoking process for hams would go on for days, sometimes a week, with the fire carefully managed to keep that smoke flowing cool and steady. By the end, a properly smoked ham had a deep mahogany exterior, slightly firm to the touch, with that unmistakable aroma that I can still close my eyes and smell right now. A smoked ham treated this way, stored in a cool root cellar, could last well over a year. We are not talking about a few weeks, a year. And it did not just survive, it actually developed more depth of flavor over time. Now the root cellar is its own essential part of this whole system, and I want to make sure you understand what it actually provided. A good root cellar, built into the earth beneath a barn or the house itself, maintained a temperature between 32 and 40 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. The earth insulated it naturally. That temperature range is cold enough to slow down any remaining bacterial activity significantly, but not so cold that it freezes and destroys the texture of what is stored. Humidity in a root cellar stays between 85 and 95%, which keeps things from drying out completely, while also discouraging certain molds. Salted and smoked hams would hang from the ceiling. Crocks of preserved sausage sat on shelves. Jars of pressure-canned meat lined the walls. It was like walking into a grocery store that your family built with their own hands and stocked with food they raised themselves. Speaking of pressure canning, let me walk you through how that worked because it was a huge part of how we preserved chicken, beef, and the smaller cuts of pork that were not going to be smoked or salt cured. Pressure canning reaches temperatures of 240 to 250 degrees Fahrenheit, which is hotter than boiling water can ever get without pressure. That temperature is what it takes to destroy the spores of dangerous bacteria in low-acid foods, like meat. You cannot use a regular water bath canner for meat. It does not get hot enough. Full stop. Our families used large stovetop pressure canners over propane burners, and the process was done in big community batches. The meat was cut into chunks, packed into clean mason jars, covered with boiling broth or water, leaving about an inch of space at the top, and then processed under 10 to 15 pounds of pressure for 75 minutes for pint jars and 90 minutes for quart jars. After processing, you let the pressure come all the way down on its own, never force it, and then the jars sit undisturbed for a full day. When they seal, you hear that little ping sound. The lid pulls down concave in the center, and you know it is good. Properly canned meat stored in a cool, dark place at around 50 to 70 degrees stays safe and edible for 1 to 2 years. I have personally eaten chicken that was canned 18 months before, and it was tender and completely fine. Now I want to talk about one more method that most people outside of communities like ours have genuinely never heard of, and it might be the most fascinating one of all. We preserved meat in lard, rendered pork fat. This is an ancient technique that goes back thousands of years and was common across Europe long before refrigeration existed. The process starts with rendering the fat, which means you slowly melt it down over low heat, straining out every single impurity, every bit of water, every small piece of tissue, until you are left with a pure, clear, white fat that solidifies into a creamy solid as it cools. It has to be completely clean because any water or debris left in the fat will cause it to go rancid and ruin everything stored in it. Once you have that rendered lard, you cook your meat very slowly, completely submerged in the fat at a low temperature around 225 degrees, for 3 to 4 hours until it is fall-apart tender. Then you pack that cooked meat into clean crocks or glass jars, and you pour the warm rendered fat over it until every single piece of meat is buried under at least an inch of fat. The fat hardens as it cools, creating an airtight barrier that completely cuts off oxygen from the meat. Bacteria that cause spoilage need oxygen to survive, and the fat seal denies them that completely. Stored in a root cellar that stayed consistently below 55 degrees, that meat could last for months. You would scoop out a piece whenever you needed it, fry it up in a pan, and it was extraordinary. Crispy on the outside, incredibly rich and flavorful inside. Nothing from a modern grocery store comes close. The last thing I want to leave you with is something that might not sound like a preservation method at first, but was just as important as anything else we did. It was the mindset. Nothing in our community was ever wasted. When a hog was slaughtered, the organs were eaten fresh that day or the next. The bones were boiled into broth that was then canned. The fat was rendered into lard. The scraps that were left over were ground and seasoned to become scrapple, which is a Pennsylvania Dutch tradition that goes back to the very founding of this region. The intestines were cleaned and used as natural casings for sausage. Every single thing that animal had to offer fed someone. And because of that, a family that raised 2 or 3 hogs a year could genuinely eat protein every single day for 12 months without spending $1 at a grocery store. When I left my community at 19, I walked into a world of electric refrigerators and plastic-wrapped meat and grocery store shelves that somehow seem permanent and stable. But those shelves are not stable. We all saw that a few years ago when supply chains broke down and those shelves emptied out. The Amish did not panic then, and they would not panic now because they carry this knowledge in their hands, in their routines, in the way they were raised. I carry it too. And my whole reason for making this video is to make sure you carry some of it as well, because this is not just history. This is a skill set that worked for thousands of years and will keep on working long after the electricity goes out.